But that's, of course, development. You have the same issue pertaining to the creation. In fact, you have, in a sense, two creations. The creation in Genesis chapter 1 and the creation in Genesis chapter 2. If you analyze them, in the first count, man gets created before the beasts. In the second count, man is created before the beasts. These two separate chapters dealing with the creation, two distinct and different, of course, parallels. If one is to go on further to the context of New Testament or the Old Testament and science, just to start off with Genesis chapter 6 verse 3, we are told that God, in a sense, just before the flood, He decides to limit man's lifespan to 120 years. Yet you find in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 to 32, 10 descendants of Noah had lifespans dating from 600 or 148 to 600 years. So how does one explain the anomaly that on one hand you have the lifespan of man being 120 years. In another account, the lifespan of man is 600 years. In another chapter further on, even though God decides to limit the lifespan of man. If you look at the creation of the world, in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was on the face of the waters. Now, it's possible to admit that at the existence of creation, what was to become the universe was in a state of gaseous state. But to mention the presence of water at this particular stage is purely imaginary. Verse 3 to 5, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw the light was good. And God separated the light, and of course, from the darkness, God called the light day, and God called the day, the darkness, He called it night. Now that raises two questions. Because the light circulating in the heavens is as a result of complex reaction of the stars. Yet in the creation account we are told that the actual stars or the lights of the firmament were only created on the fourth day. So how is it possible to have the existence of light when the source of that light was not in fact created a little later on? And of course one could go on. It speaks about the creation of vegetation prior to the creation of the sun. When we know, of course, scientifically speaking, that vegetation cannot yield without sunlight. So how is it possible that we see the creation of vegetation without the creation of the sun? And one could go on the entire chapter and find particular flaws. But the problem is that at the last stage, once the creation is completed, after this difficult work, in chapter 2, we are told, and on the seventh day, God finished the work and He rested. And He was refreshed from all the work that He had done. We know that in the Quran we read, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ وَمَا مَسَّنَا فِي اللُّغُوبِ. That we did create all and the heavens and the earth and all that is in between in 6 epochs, 6 periods of civilization or great periods of time, and no weariness, no tiredness, no fatigue did we feel in our creation. Take your choice. So that's particularly one specific reference. So in a sense, what some biblical scholars are now telling us that most of the alterations basically come, in fact the belief amongst many non-Bible fundamentalists, errors perhaps arising from faulty eyesight, errors from faulty hearing, errors of the mind, errors of judgment, difficulties in terms of the historical and geographical location, and so on and so forth. You find further on a noted scholar called Ellen G. White writing a Bible commentary. She states that the Bible we read today is the work of many copyists who have in most instances done their work with marvelous accuracy, but copyists have of course not been infallible. And God allegedly, most evidently, has not seen fit to preserve them altogether from error in transcribing. And she goes on to say that in certain instances, learned men had in some instances changed the words, thinking they were making it plain, when of course in reality they were mystifying that which was plain by causing it to lean to their established views which were governed by tradition. You have the same problem when one looks further on in terms of the genealogy, the genealogical account of Jesus. Of the four gospel writers, you find between David and Jesus, Matthew's gospel records only 26 ancestors. Between David and Jesus, Luke records 41 forefathers. Of course, we find the only name common is that of Joseph the carpenter, and Mary is not mentioned in any context, because we know, biblically speaking, Jesus had no earthly father. So if he had a genealogy, it would be from the genealogy of his mother, not the father. Yet you find two gospel accounts with conflicting versions in respect of this, the genealogy of Christ. Further on, the Kingdom Interlinear, which is the Jehovah's Witnesses translation of the Bible, states that in copying the inspired originals by hand, the element of human frailty entered in. And so, of course, none of the thousands of copies in extent in the original language are, of course, perfect duplicates. The result is that no two copies are exactly alike. The evidence is that the original text of the Christian Greek scriptures has, of course, been tampered with, historically speaking. That's another particular comment by Dr. Joseph Parker, who was from the Moody Bible Institute, or certainly quoted by a book from the Moody Bible Institute where he deals with the specific context in terms of the biblical accounts as they exist today. One finds scientific problems. In the book of Psalms, chapter 102, verses 25 to 26, we are told the earth and the heavens shall perish. In Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 to 11, we find the same reference. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and 4, we have the expression that the earth and heaven shall abide forever. So, shall the earth and heaven abide forever, or of course shall it perish? We have other references, of course, which give the indication that the earth has pillars. In other words, there was an ancient view in terms of existing belief that the earth was, of course, standing on some kind of stilts to maintain the stability. The issue of hydrology, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 13 to 17, it speaks about the rainbow after the flood as an everlasting covenant between God and the earth and every living creature on earth. Everlasting covenant to what? That obviously there will not be a further flood. Of course, we know scientifically today that the rainbow, in a sense, is a direct refraction of sunlight. And so what the account given was, of course, something which had developed in a particular context. The point I'm trying to emphasize here is not to cast aspersions. I'm not saying the Bible is an evil book or it's a bad book. In the essence, we accept the revelation given to these particular mighty messengers of God. But what we are saying is that they were not preserved in the original format. And so you have these kind of discrepancies which arise. This is quite an interesting analysis. Purification of women after childbirth. In Leviticus chapter 12, verse 1 to 5, we are told that if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then as a result of the childbirth, she shall be unclean for 7 days. A period of 7 days, that is. But strangely enough, if she conceives a female child, then she's unclean for, of course, 14 days. So how does one explain the anomaly between these particular two? Of course, it's quite simple. You had a community of religious priests, the rabbis, the rabbinical authority, the Sanhedrin that were passing the so-called fatwas, as we have fatwas today. In fact, if you look at some of the fatwas which have been passed recently in Egypt and in certain parts in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, also raises certain questions. The point is, these are all too human workings of men. And it stands to reason that when man has a particular role in editing the original books of God, these references and these anomalies come about. One could go on further. Menstruating woman has to be ostracized from society. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 15, verse 19, if a woman menstruates, she shall be put apart for a period of 7 days, and anyone who touches her or her linen or sits in a chair shall be unclean till the evening, even though he baths thereafter. You find, of course, in the Quran, the issue of ceremonial impurity applies to both men and applies to both women itself. And of course, there's no ostracize where people are ostracized from society. In Leviticus chapter 11, verse 20, we speak about the existence of four-footed chickens. Some translators have seen the problem and have rendered the term as insects. Of course, we know that no insect in the world, of course, is four-footed. You have creatures of mythology, the creatures like the unicorn, which obviously the existence highly questioned. We find them in popular literature like Lord of the Rings, like Harry Potter, and so on and so forth. The shape of the earth being flat. In two different references, Daniel chapter 4 verse 10 to 11, Matthew chapter 4 and 8, and Luke chapter 4 verse 5. Zoology, you have problems in respect of hares and particular animals. The hare is a culture, ants have no rulers, serpents consume dust, seven-headed leopards and dragons. Disinfectant to prevent plague and disease in Leviticus chapter 14 verse 49. You have, interestingly, two birds, and cedarwood and scarlet and a hyssop, and we are told that you kill the bird, and what subsequently happens is that the living bird, take the living bird and you dip it in the blood of the slain bird and in the running water, and of course disinfect the house to prevent plague and leprosy. Of course, we know today blood is a great carrier of germs and so on. The bitter water test for adultery in Numbers chapter 5 verse 11 to 31. We have a woman who is accused of adultery. The priest, of course, shall bring her and she shall take the stand before the Lord. And of course, he shall take some holy water and some clay jar and put some dust in the water. And of course, once she drinks it, if it causes her thigh to rot, it would be sure proof of her infidelity. Now, the point is, these are again historical discrepancies or something which arises in a particular context. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 13 to 18, we have an interesting test of virginity testing. How does one test? And quite interestingly enough, that when in an accusation of slander, we are told that when of course there's an accusation made by the community at large, then in order to prove the fidelity and the virginity of the lady, the father shall bring the tokens of her virginity and shall display and spread the cloth to the elders of the community as proof. And the elders shall of course punish the slanderer in that particular allegation. But you're dealing with a specifically chauvinistic society. What does one do with the cloth in order to decide the virginity testing? Something which is akin to the Zulus in KwaZulu-Natal, which we have a particular reference. And lastly, of course, we have these are specific tests in referring to tests in Christian believers and so on. Speaking out, casting out devils, speaking in foreign tongues, picking up serpents, and so on and so forth. Of course, those are references you find in Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20, something which obviously hasn't been tried by any person today, because it arises out of a particular context. It arises out of people who are superstitious. Here we have 4 different references in 4 different gospel accounts when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb or to the sepulchre to look for Jesus, and she finds at 4 different intervals 4 different and specific people. In one account she finds an angel, in another account she finds a young man, in another account she finds 2 men, and in the 4th account she finds 2 angels. So of course, if these particular writers were inspired, that raises a question, where did these particular sources, of course, come from? It obviously evolved out of different time intervals. Over and above that, besides the existing books, we find these particular books which have basically formed the foundations of Christianity, the books of Jasher, the books of the wars of the Lord, and so on. But there are books in the Old Testament which are mentioned as inspired, and you look them up, you find they're not there. And these additional books which I've mentioned in the Catholic Encyclopedia, you find obviously not found in the King James Version. The book of Judith, of Tobit, Esther, Maccabees, 2nd Maccabees, the book of Wisdom. In one Bible, in the Roman Catholic Bible or the Douay-Rheims Bible, you find them. In the others, you will not find them. So that, of course, raises certain questions in respect of development of these books. Why are they excluded? What was the reason for them being excluded? And because we're discussing both books tonight, it obviously behoves me to want us to do justice to both particular books. At the outset, you find that the name Quran is frequently used. In fact, mentioned in the book itself, which states to whom, why, when, and in what language it was revealed or delivered. It was revealed to Muhammad, peace be upon him, over a period of 23 years in Arabic, memorized immediately after revelation. And you find the famous verse in Surah 75, verse 17, Inna nahnu nazzalna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun, that it is for us to ensure the preservation and the collection of this particular manuscript or this book. So at the outset you find, in contradistinction to the Bible, that the book identifies itself as divinely inspired. It identifies itself. A notorious European writer on the Quran, Sir William Mere, was made to state in his book, The Life of Muhammad, that there is probably in the world no other book which has remained 12 centuries, now 14, with so pure a text. A hostile critic of Islam. In fact, we have here a Sana manuscripts. These manuscripts were discovered in 1972 in Yemen, dating to the 1st century of the Hijrah. In fact, according to some scholars, they are earlier than the manuscripts in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, the one that was done by Uthman, or the Uthmanic recension. This was discovered in Sana in Yemen, and most shockingly enough, in fact, they date to the first era of the Hijrah. In other words, immediately after the Hijrah, going back and discovered as late as 1972. Manuscripts dating back to that time. I said the earliest manuscript in Christianity dates back to the 4th century, apart from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Hebrew of the Old Testament dates to the 9th century. Here you have existing evidence of the Sana manuscripts. A particular European philosopher of the Quran, Thomas Carlyle, stated that if a book comes from the heart, it will contrive to reach all hearts. All art, all authorcraft are small amount to that. One would say that the primary characteristics of the Quran is that of its genuineness, of it being a bona fide book. In other words, the authenticity behind that particular book. You have further references by, this was a famous translator, Arthur Arbery, that when he reads the Quran, it's as if he hears the sounding of the beat. There's a particular kind of rhythm, which could only be possible through means of divine revelation. The kind of rhythm which has, in a sense, mesmerized certain groups, certain communities, people who never subscribed or ascribed to Islam. The Catholic Encyclopedia, in fact, this is just jumping the gun, but the Catholic Encyclopedia stated that over the years, many theories have been offered in respect of the Quran or the origins of the Quran, and it's forced to confess that today no sensible person accepts him. Now, what are these theories? What are these specific theories? If one has to look at the theories, the first theory could possibly be that the Prophet Muhammad was the author. In other words, he authored the book and he lied to the people. The second theory could be that he obtained it from other sources or other religious scriptures. The third source is that the Holy Quran does not have a human author, but of course is from the realm of the divine. So one has to obviously take one's choice. You see, you can't be a liar and a crazy man at the same time. If somebody is a liar, then he obviously is not crazy. But if you look at missionary literature, and of course Orientalist literature, the understanding is that the Prophet was both deceitful and at the same time he was crazy. They called him a mythomaniac, astaghfirullah. But you can't be both. You can be one or the other, but you can't be both, or you can be neither. Now, when you look at the first assumption in respect of the Prophet being the author, it's highly abnormal to challenge the testimony of a person who claims divine authorship. One of the common historical points we know in Islam is that the Prophet Muhammad was called a Sadiq al-Amin, or the truthful one. He never told a lie, to such an extent that even during the time specifically of him claiming prophethood, non-Muslim Quraysh were prepared to leave their valuables with him. That was the degree of honesty that they had before him. This third point is that as far as the material benefits are concerned, what material benefits did he sought to gain? We know, historically speaking, that if one has to look at his time period, he was in a financially secure position prior to prophethood as opposed to after prophethood. So if he sought material benefit, why choose his lifestyle, which would obviously lead him to effective poverty? And of course, we have the noted claim that when they asked him about giving him the wealth and the most beautiful of women and so on, and what was his reply? He replied to his uncle, he said, "Oh, my uncle, if they put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left hand, I will not give up this message until I die, since it's from the Lord of the worlds." You find numerous boycotts, numerous financial predicaments. The second allegation pertaining to the fact that the Prophet Muhammad copied it from other sources. We know, historically speaking, that he was an ummi, an unlettered person. In Surah 29, verse 48, we read the expression that thou wast not able to recite any book before this. This was revealed, nor after this, in order that the doubters or the talkers of vanity might have doubted. So you were an ummi, scripturally unlettered, someone who was unlettered. In Surah 29, verse 54, you find the divine style, you find a consistency. For a period of 23 years, if you were to author a book over 23 years, somewhere along the line, there would be a lack of consistency. But you find the message eternally remains the same. The message is basically the same. Prior to the Quran, there was no single Arabic book written on the subject. So here's the anomaly. You have an illiterate person speaking to an illiterate community, producing a divine book which had never basically, in a sense, postulating facts and circumstances which were unheard of or unknown to man at particular intervals in time. In fact, the first Arabic Bible dates to the 10th century. So the allegation now that there was some kind of copying would mean 400 years before. It's not possible to copy a book when the actual book in Arabic was written in the 10th century. The first translation, or the Arabic translation of the Quran, of the Bible, was the 10th century AD, 400 to 500 years after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad.